Good afternoon, everyone, and you are very welcome to today's session. Dr. Paul St. John Smith is going to talk to us about evolutionary perspectives on drug use and addiction. And just a brief introduction for Paul. Paul trained at Oxford in the 1970s, qualifying in 1979. He trained as a general practitioner from 1980 to 1982. He then joined Hoffman La Roche as a research physician in psychopharmacology in 1982 and investigated a range of psychotropic agents. In 1987, he returned to study psychiatry full-time, and he's worked in a number of London hospitals, including Barnet, Guy's, Greenwich, St. Thomas's, Watford, St. Albans, and Harperbury. Paul recently retired as a community adult psychiatrist, and he is interested in the philosophy of science, evidence-based medicine, and particularly evolutionary psychiatry, utilizing the Neo-Darwinian theories of evolution as a way of understanding psychiatric disorders. He's contributed to a number of peer-reviewed papers, chapters, and a current very important book on evolutionary psychiatry, as well as papers on substance misuse, dual diagnosis, an area where he has also worked clinically, psychopharmacology, professionalism, suicide, and depression. Paul has taught in Hertfordshire, Cambridge, and London universities, as well as presenting to a number of training schemes and acting as examiner for the Royal College of Psychiatrists. Paul is currently chair of the Royal College of Psychiatrists Evolutionary Psychiatry Special Interest Group and a founding member of the group. So thank you to Adam, and I'm going to hand over to Paul. And just from a housekeeping point of view, if you wish, you can add questions to chat as we go along, and at the end we'll try and have an open discussion, and people can pose questions live or through the chat medium. So over to you, Paul, and thank you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I notice Randolph Ness is here. I would just like to say a very big thanks to Randolph before I even start, because without reading his fabulous papers, I wouldn't have got an interest in evolution and psychiatry. And there's also a thank you to be had for Alfonso Troisi and Martin Bruner, but mostly Randy. So thanks very much. First slide, I'm going to look at a number of different perspectives regarding drug abuse and alcohol abuse. And I'm going to cover what we call ultimate as well as some of the proximate reasons as to why people use various chemicals. And just talking to a layperson, people know why people take drugs. You know, sometimes it's for medical reasons, but also sometimes it's because they want some sort of feeling of pleasure or some transcendent or psychedelic effect, which begs the question, why do they want to take it for a transcendent or a psychedelic effect? As well as people use drugs and alcohol for blocking aversive reactions, things like pain or misery. Now, I just want to make clear for the generalists watching this presentation that evolutionary accounts here, they're supposed to supplement the general psychiatry and the immediate mechanisms. It's not an alternative or some form of separate theory. It is additional to understanding current scientific mechanisms. Now, the way we often explain the evolutionary models is via the Tinbergen model, and here's a diagrammatic representation of the model, and here is adopted from Professor Ness's book, the way of tabulating what we're talking about. So in terms of normal psychiatry, and we look at how does a trait develop during the lifetime of an organism and how does it work, including, you know, what are the neurotransmitters, but also the psychological mechanisms. What we do differently in evolution is look at what is the history from the development of the human species, and the way of doing of this, of course, is through other species, which is done the whole time in pharmacology, because you have to use other species for much of the research. But we look at it with a slightly different perspective on the sort of lead up to human brain and a human society functioning. And we look at both phylogeny and adaptive functioning. So we've looked at how the trait contributes to an organism's fitness in its natural environment, which is rather different to just looking at how an individual develops it in their lifetime. So we look at these effects over human evolutionary timescales, and there are some paradoxes that become apparent, because part of Neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory states that a trait cannot evolve if it reduces the overall reproductive success of its carrier. Now, of course, this, in terms of substance abuse, brings us to a problem that, by and large, certainly extreme use of substances or dangerous use probably reduces reproductive success. So why does it continue in the human genome, insofar as drug and alcohol use have a genetic basis to some extent? So this is one of the paradoxes. How come it's still around if it's so negative? A second paradox I'll come to later is why these chemicals are around in nature at all. I wish to also make clear that some people think evolutionists are adaptationists, so that when we say something's evolved, everything is adaptive. So I'd like to get rid of this idea at the beginning. We don't think that severe illnesses and reactions are adaptive. And you have to think about things like having backache or having appendicitis. They are not the adaptations. The reason, why we get backache, one of the evolutionary ideas, is because of being bipedal. So it's the bipedality that is selected for, not backache. And that can apply to things like sickle cell and lactose intolerance. And in fact, there are different models. And again, I think this is taken from one of Randy's books, but it may be one of Alfonso's. I've forgotten where I've got this now. But these are the reasons disorders may be actively maintained through a number of evolutionary processes. And I think it's probably best to actually not go through them all in depth, because this is, again, general evolutionary theory, not specific. And you can divide them really despite natural selection and because of natural selection, but I won't go into those in depth in this talk. And another way of looking at it is more familiar to the general audience, which is covered by Gluckman and Randy in various books, and we've put it in our book, Evolutionary Psychiatry, Current Perspectives. And there are 10 or 11 reasons why evolutionary things occur and persist. So these are pathways for the persistence of disease or disorder, and probably the commonest one we come across is mismatch, and we will talk about mismatch and alcohol a little later. And of interest also is things like life history, excessive defense mechanisms. In terms of psychiatry, number 4, arms races against pathogens, is less important, and so on. And I will go through these as we go through talking about drugs and alcohol to some extent. So these are the range of possibilities that we can think of rather than the specifics. Also, individual traits that are selected for, they may be adaptations in certain circumstances, but sometimes, even if a trait is normal, it can not be useful in certain environments, or it becomes excessive. And of course, traits in individuals can become abnormal. And sometimes traits arise from mechanisms that are completely unrelated to those that it evolved to do. An example of this is sometimes chemicals that we take make people feel very, very depressed. So you get a depression from a mechanism which would not naturally be found in an ancestral environment. So we understand that drugs cause immense harm to individuals and societies. So people have big health as well as social problems from taking large amounts of drugs and alcohol. And sometimes they have problems the first time they take it. So it doesn't have to be something regularly taken or even addiction, but usually we're talking about people with persistent use, dependent use and addiction. But people have died sometimes when they drink for the first time, and certainly have died after taking street drugs for the first time. Yet other drugs, notably things like chocolate and coffee, are enjoyed by people around the world. And looking into modern history, I suppose you'd call it, well, not really modern, but written history and archaeological history, drug use has been found in almost all human societies, or one drug or another, not all drugs, especially things like alcohol and to some degree opiates and cannabis. And this suggests that if something is found in many societies, that there is probably some form of evolutionary explanation. If it only occurs in a small group of people, that's rather less likely. And of course, we recognize that addiction arises through the interaction of the substances we're talking about, generally with evolutionarily selected ancient systems that were designed to promote the pursuit of rewards. And I'll go into that as well a little bit later. So going straight into the part 2 now, we ask several questions about drug use. Why do people use drugs when they are non-nutritional substances? And then here is the second part, and this is part of the work by Hagen et al., which, if you notice, most of the drugs that we talk about up until recent times, certainly the last 100 years, most of the drugs are plant-based. And things like opiates, cannabis, many of the psychedelics, and of course alcohol itself, come from plant sources. And one has to wonder why plants produce chemicals that affect the human nervous system. Well, I'm sure people have plenty of ideas about that. You know, it comes to mind fairly quickly why plants may have toxins. Now, just to delineate the different types of theories, we can divide the theories and the evolutionary pathways for the persistence of drug use into the following: pharmacophagy and infection control. Again, this is the work of Hagen, and that's eating substances, usually from plants, sometimes animals, sometimes from things like soils and clays and things, but it's usually plants. So pharmacophagy is something that's seen in animals and other species, right the way from butterflies through to primates. A second class of theory is the psychotropic self-medication. When people know what these drugs do, they medicate to manipulate their emotions. There is mismatch theory, which is related to modern day environments being different to the environment of evolutionary adaptation. Then there are trade-offs, which is the trade-off of using drugs versus whatever condition or whatever is going on in the person originally. And then I'd mention things called costly signaling and handicap theories, including sexual selection, and also bring into the discussion placebo and various ritual healing effects and drug use in that way. And I'll just mention, I'll do a plug for the book that many of us have, I can see on the screen, have already been involved with. And there's a chapter 12 in this book, which we go through these various theories in more depth than I can go through in an hour's talk. So if people are interested in evolutionary psychiatry and in particular addictions, chapter 12 goes through these theories in much more depth. And the chapter 12 contains the following discussions. So I'll move these along because these will be available after the talk. So The first theory that really got my interest was the Hagen paper with Sullivan on the paradox of drug reward. I was talking about the fact that most of these substances are plant-based, and why do plants carry these chemicals? Well, of course, it's to deter parasites and herbivores from devouring them. So plants that contained nasty chemicals that are insecticidal or deter larger creatures tended to survive. So a process of natural selection has enabled many plant species to survive because they contain noxious chemicals. And of course, one of the ways, I mean, there are many more noxious chemicals than there are psychotropic agents, but psychotropic agents in the plants that we're talking about, the relevant plants, affect the central nervous systems and sometimes peripheral nervous systems of the various herbivores or creatures that are eating them. And of course, if you make an animal or any species less aware of its environment or less able to respond because of sedation, intoxication, whatever, hallucinations, they become liable to predation, or of course they may just feel terribly ill and they don't like the feeling at all. But of course, some of these chemicals, although they may make people more vulnerable, people learned, and some animals learn, that it has a useful effect. And if they're not predated by some nasty, lion or leopard or something, they can regulate the amount of these toxins they use, and don't have to take sort of fatal amounts or amounts that are really dangerous. So there's a degree of learning in some of these cases. But that begs the question, is why do humans start using them in the first place? Well, sometimes people must have taken certain plants and learned that they had some of these effects. So there must have been a sort of first time. And then, of course, human beings have shared culture and cumulative culture. They can tell others the effect of plants or whatever. And one of the reasons we think this is quite an old thing is because of the chemical defenses, and there is evidence of the evolution of our cytochrome P450, etc., suggesting that these substances have been taken, absorbed, and detoxified for many thousands and millions of years. So these substances are not novel, unlike the chemical drugs made by the drug industry in the last 100 or so years. So over, let's say, 500 million years of evolution from the pre-Cambrian, so we've got the Cambrian explosion, that these chemicals had been in the environment, in the race between creatures to stop the predators eating them and so on and so forth. And consequently, a lot of the detoxification enzymes are very old indeed. And some of the drugs, of course, do not cause any particular central nervous system pleasant effects. They may cause headaches, sweating, nausea, and vomiting. And of course, actually, we know that actually things like nicotine, when people start smoking, they can feel very, very sick. And of course, that begs the question, why would you take something like nicotine if it makes you feel very, very sick the first time you use it? And this is what Hagen refers to as the paradox of neophyte use, why people take it once, but then after feeling really sort of sick and faint, do they take it again? Now, one of his theories is, and I mentioned it earlier in the list, is that these drugs may deter parasites in the creatures, in the plants that make them. So let's take nicotine. But many creatures can be parasitized, and if they take on board things like nicotine from tobacco, it actually acts as an anti-parasitic agent. And there's an example of this. It's called the hornworm, where the caterpillar, if it consumes nicotine, it avoids the paratization from a certain type of wasp. So one of the theories of why early humans may have used some of these drugs is the antiparasitic and anti-helminthic effect. If you note that modern day insecticides called neonicotinoids, it's not an accident that they're nicotine derivatives. And so one of the theories of initial usage was the benefits that it conveyed when taken from a plant, that some of these chemicals may have produced an anti-helminthic or an anti-parasitic effect, so that would have been primary rather than just the I suppose the adverse effects from these drugs, which may have been more evident. But there is also, of course, to take into account the emotional changes that can be occur from nicotine and the pleasurable effects, so that the pleasurable effects may have led to continual use, but it may have had an advantage in terms of getting rid of parasites, which include intestinal worms as well as other creatures. So one of the theories is that under initial conditions, the ability to consume plant-derived but otherwise toxic substances may confer these sort of physical advantages to others. But the corollary of that is that under modern conditions, where, for instance, lifespan is a lot longer, taking these chemicals is more harmful than useful. Going back to the Darwinian theory that neural circuitry has undergone strong selective pressure and that there is extensive modification towards behaviors that promote survival and reproduction, these things can be somewhat unconscious. But in the more conscious level, we know that emotions can be conveniently divided into aversive and pleasurable, let's say. Pleasurable is for reinforcement in a response to propitious circumstances, and adversive emotions in response to environmental or other threats or things that go wrong. And when humans started taking some of these plant chemicals, they may have been able to diminish some of the aversive effects or recreate or increase positive affect, especially things like the dopamine stimulants and agonists. So in the ancestral environment, these plant chemicals could have been used to diminish things like pain or misery to some degree, but because of the limitations, the very limited amounts of the material that they could ingest, this was not a big problem. So despite them encouraging, the drugs encouraging further use, there wasn't a large amount to be had. So before 10,000–12,000 years ago, the Neolithic Revolution, where there is distinct agriculture which can produce large amounts of poppies and cultivation of these drug-containing plants, you would have to find these things naturally, and there is therefore a very limited supply, so addiction would be less of a problem. But once you've got farming and cultivation, you have a problem of much larger amounts being available for certain people. So it's about abundance, and of course current abundance of these drugs has become notorious. Now that means there's only been 10,000 or so years for our genome to catch up with the amounts that are now available. This is sometimes called genome lag, which is one of the central pillars of mismatch. So our genes and our detoxification systems haven't caught up with the amount of alcohol or other drugs that can be synthesized. Now, looking at this from a slightly sideways point of view, that we were talking about drugs overriding emotions. Now, if emotions were that useful, why can we override them? Well, this really boils down to, I think, Randolph Ness's smoke detector and signal detection effect, that often certainly adverse emotions are triggered quite easily and may be excessive. And I'll talk about the drug detector, the smoke detector effect a little later. And of course, the use of drugs to give positive emotions speaks for itself. But of course, this is not always safe, as we know, because if you feel good and have positive emotions in an environment which was aversive, it can put you under threat because you failed to respond to the emotions or the stimuli, and therefore you put yourself in danger. And that's somewhat akin to the dangers, for instance, when people are manic. There are also life history ideas of why people start to use drugs, and in particular, people that experience, severe neglect or abuse in childhood or in adulthood often have high levels of negative affect, and in insurmountable adverse circumstances, people use pharmacological means to overcome this. And of course, there are drugs that we use as psychiatrists to overcome these things, which there is controversy about how useful they are and how safe they are. And of course, the street drugs, the drugs of addiction that do this, things like cocaine and amphetamines, are far more dangerous than the antidepressants in terms of the immediate dangers to people's well-being. I've mentioned this a little earlier, that there seems to be some ability of humans to regulate the amount of these substances from plants that they've taken, that people have worked out how much they can take without being thoroughly sick. But of course, this is not reliable. And before, even when you have the pharmaceutical industry determining the amount of medicine or active chemical in drugs, taking a plant could be quite a risky thing to do in terms of the amount of chemicals present in a given dose, or the amount of plant you're eating. Now, the pharmacophagy hypothesis suggests that advantages, and this is very similar to the neurotoxicity hypothesis, that the self-medication advantages arose when humans learned to overcome the cues of toxicity, whether it's bitter taste or feeling nauseous or faint, especially when small amounts were therapeutic and seemed to be therapeutic in certain circumstances. Going back to the parasitic and antihelminthic ideas, if you look at the table on the left are the drugs that are present in many plants that are used in substance misuse, and it's interesting that they all have various medical properties, as well as the emotional and sort of primary psychotropic effect. And one of the theories is that if they had very good insecticidal or other medical basis, that the selection would be that that people who found these drugs pleasurable and used them in moderate amounts would actually have an advantage over those that didn't have the benefit of being able to take on board these chemicals for whatever purposes they're there on the right. So that what they're trying to say is that these feelings of pleasure and being able to take these things may have been selected for over the thousands and millions of years of human evolution, and not just produced emotional regulation, but produced some chemical effect that was also advantageous to the individual. Now, alcohol is a little bit different to the drugs that are found in plants to deter herbivores. Alcohol may be a substance that is used in fresh fruit for getting dispersal of the fruit by attracting frugivores to eat the fruit, and so the dispersal of the seed is improved. So alcohol is slightly different to the drugs. It's not there purely to deter animals from eating the plant. It may be the other way round. And of course, it's clear that many animals have the enzymes alcohol dehydrogenase and aldehyde dehydrogenase and so on. They have these enzymes present in their genome, or the coding for it in their genome, because those animals which are able to consume fresh fruit had an advantage. And of course, fruits are best eaten when they're ripe, and often nasty chemicals are put in unripe fruit, such as malic acid, which tastes very, very sour and horrible, or poisons even. And so the advantages of being able to smell alcohol and to metabolize alcohol may have been selected for as well. And so we as human beings actually have evolved to be able to metabolize alcohol in limited amounts. And the operative thing is limited amounts. Now, subsequent to the Neolithic agricultural revolution, of course, there are large surpluses of fruits and grains which can be fermented. You might ask, why do yeasts, for instance, or certain yeasts, produce large amounts of alcohol? And that's thought to be because they have an advantage by using alcohol to deter other microorganisms from utilizing the nutrients. But of course, human beings have learnt that yeasts ferment grain and fruit, and for thousands of years there was the availability of things like beer or wine. But of course, in more modern times, there's been distilling technology, so concentrations of alcohol go from lightly brewed beers, which are 2-3% alcohol, up to the stronger wines, which are 12 to 14%. And of course, you have distilling technology where there's alcohol concentrations of greater than 50%. And of course, you can distill right up to 100% alcohol. And these are much more dangerous levels of alcohol and present in much larger amounts. One of the corollaries of the alcohol consumption theories is that with the rise of larger settlements, which came about as the Neolithic Revolution, actually boiling water and fermenting substances protected against various pathogens that were in contaminated water supplies, so that people that drank wine or beer may have had an advantage depending on how it was produced. And certainly there are theories that in England they're able to deal with sort of cholera and typhoid because the English, particularly in the last few hundred years, drank a lot of beer and tea, both of which require boiled water. And so prior to knowing about bacteria, there may have been advantages drinking things like beer. And the last paragraph is quite important because I think the enzyme systems we were talking about, the alcohol dehydrogenase and so on, that evolved to process small amounts of alcohol can now be presented with vast quantities of alcohol containing drinks, some of them highly concentrated. Now, moving on to the other theories about why people use drugs, going beyond pharmacophagy and mismatch, is that there have been some theories, and these have some traction, I think, but I'm not keen on some of them because one or two of them have actually been tested and it's not true. And they're tested by saying, if people use alcohol and drugs, do they have more children? And there is some conflicting evidence in different parts of these theories. So the use of drugs or alcohol could potentially increase fitness, not because it's good for the individual, but because it does the following: it advertises biological quality. In other words, the person can take quantities of drugs showing how strong they are or they're sexually mature. that has not been shown to be correct from the studies that I've seen, that actually that does not pan out in the data. There is some argument about decreasing inhibitions, people having, beer goggles or feeling disinhibited and having sex. Now, that might occur in the evolutionary environment to some degree, but of course with contraception it changes the nature and the rules of whether or not people get pregnant. They're certainly much more capable of getting sexually transmitted disease, which would not be good for evolutionary, reproductive success. And sometimes, it's just the increased socialization ideas that, and Robin Dunbar goes through this, that alcohol has helped people be successful in life because of increased socialization, and is why, alcohol's used at all corporate events. That's more true of alcohol than it is other street drugs. So those theories in more depth is signaling theories of drug use include the use where it's suggesting, it's a signal of honest, costly signal of biological quality. I think that's superficially has some face validity, but as I say, the data that's being looked at doesn't suggest that works very well. And there is evidence, though, in life history that people do engage in dangerous behaviours, which includes substance misuse and getting pregnant early, or getting people pregnant when young, and it's correlated with substance misuse in people that have a poor start in life. So consistent with these ideas, that adolescents with alcohol use disorders are more sexually active, have more sexual partners, and initiate sexual activity at younger ages. But whether or not they bring up more children successfully, and that's an evolutionary advantage, is something that needs to be looked into in more depth. I think the studies that have looked at it don't really show this particularly well. So in other words, that the alcohol use is part of a past life history. Now, a corollary of this is that women use less substances because of risk taking is more expensive for women if they get pregnant when they haven't got a stable relationship. And there is some evidence, of course, and which is interesting, that women, especially when they're pregnant, are more sensitive to these chemicals in plants, and of course, to things like smoking and alcohol, which would suggest that there is actually there's some mechanism in women that deters them from using the chemicals which may be dangerous to a fetus. And of course, there are sex differences in the utilization of drugs and alcohol to some degree, although this may be overcome by individuals or in certain cultures to some degree. And I think it's interesting, whenever there are sex differences, one has to look at, is there some important evolutionary thing going on? And of course, many of the drugs we're talking about have teratogenicity and embryotoxicity. And so if this is something that humans have been exposed to over generations, it's advantageous for women to protect the fetus. And this may be why women get sort of the nausea that comes with early pregnancy especially, and so they've evolved ways of protecting themselves from these drugs, and given the reproductive costs, it's likely that ingesting neurotoxins is actually more dangerous for women than men, certainly from the perspective of producing healthy children. And I mentioned signaling and life history earlier, but sort of demonstrating strength and fitness by taking toxic substances. And again, I don't really buy that. And I think in current culture, I think it's evident that many women sort of stay away from heavy substance misusing people. It's although you do find, and without revealing any individual cases, you do find women that marry men that drink too heavily, and they continue to stay with them for one reason or another, especially in women that have low self-esteem. And so these things have to be tested and looked at empirically from an epidemiological point of view, and this is research that I think would be quite easy to do. And one of the other theories, which is mentioned by Joe Polemini, is the use of drugs in sociality, religion, and spirituality. And these are when drugs and alcohol are used in religious ceremonies and as a lubricant and so on. And this includes a lot of the psychedelics and things like the magic mushrooms and various drugs which tend not to be addictive, but produce quite nasty hallucinations in some, but to others they get a feeling of spirituality or some sort of cosmic revelation, and this can increase group cohesion if used in modest amounts with a group of people. And some people have suggested that the modern psychonauts, the people that use novel psychiatric substances, are a modern equivalent. But I'm not so sure of that, because they often do this on their own. Although they do share their experiences via the internet, it's not quite the same as being part of a religious custom. So here's my summary of the different hypotheses. So there's the mismatch and genome lag. So the traditional use of plant substances used as pharmacophagy or for medicinal purposes is out of kilter with the amounts that are now present. That secondly, the drugs that are used for changing emotional mechanisms, i.e. increasing positive or decreasing negative feelings, again are used excessively in a post-Neolithic environment. And that many of the drugs that are now present in large amounts decouple people that use them regularly from all important aspects of the external environment, which means that they feel great despite life actually getting worse and worse. So either by inducing pleasure or by removing pain. And then the anthropological theories, which I mentioned just now, which was the use of costly signaling or handicap perspectives, and in rituals had some traction, as well as the use of alcohol in spirituality and religion and other drugs. But I don't think the use in spirituality explains the widespread use of alcohol and cannabis in the general population. And so that's a sort of quick rundown of the different theories. It's a rather sketchy rundown, because each of them would warrant a talk on its own. And to put it in to actually put it in a sort of diagrammatic form, we have the sort of pivot to the central point of evolution, and the various theories about why people use alcohol and continue to use alcohol are there on the orbiting evolution. There is the emotional management, antiparasitic and medical functions, pharmacophagy, and the social theories, reproduction at the expense of health, costly signaling and handicap, and spirituality. And finally, the clinical applications. Well, if one bears in mind that these drugs are used and had these evolutionary origins, possibly, that there are a possible range of interventions which are compatible with these perspectives. So, for instance, medicines that substitute for drugs of abuse or attempt to disrupt the rewarding effects of substances can be used. So in other words, we give less dangerous drugs or drugs that sometimes block the effects of street drugs. But in my experience, I mean, I've used antabuse for stopping people drinking because it makes them feel sick and they vomit, so they don't use alcohol. But what they do is they stop using antabuse. And if you give opiate addicts opiate antagonists, they just try and avoid the opiate antagonists, so that just giving antagonists doesn't really help. Although it can be used, obviously if people have respiratory depression due to opiate use, you can use it. But the times I've used opiate agonists to resuscitate patients, they don't really, they're not pleased that you've taken them out of their slumber. Of other importance are the psychological and social interventions that could be used to deal with drug use and abuse in the wider society, is that, and this includes things like Alcoholics Anonymous and various forms of psychotherapy, we need to help people strengthen their desire not to take alcohol, but also to help them with rewards, which are the real rewards in life, if that's possible, and to see why they're using it and how to increase these positive aspects of life, and also to increase the salience of the negative consequences of use. Now, I think that's going to be difficult because we've all seen addicts that are drinking themselves to liver failure or using needles and losing limbs because of substance misuse, and they carry on doing this because the drug feels so good. But it's also about society and broader lifestyle changes in society itself, and for individuals to facilitate recovery. So lastly, also, as I mentioned, the promotion of natural rewards, which often actually feel very, very little compared with the reward of a potent drug. But encouraging natural rewards, something which the emotions are actually reflecting what is actually happening rather than a false emotion, is something to be encouraged. But the power, the emotional power of some of these drugs like cocaine is so many thousand times better than a natural reward that it's very difficult to explain this to patients. But these are things that can be looked at in terms of trying to help people leave substance misuse and addictions. So this talk has really looked at why humans are vulnerable to taking drugs and then how they became misused. It doesn't really explain addiction, but why the substances that are used. There is a paradox as to why humans should procure and become addicted to plant toxins, which I've mentioned, and some of it may be the emotional impact that these chemicals have in smaller doses, and or the Hagen's theory that actually they have byproducts which are in their natural environment antiparasitic. And then there are also various social theories about use of drugs beyond the emotional, about groups of people signaling things and disinhibition and so on and so forth, the social bonding. And I hope these ideas, although very much a range of ideas rather than a single specific theory, can be used to help inform us as doctors as to where drug addiction and abuse comes from and what can be done, certainly in terms of public health measures, rather than necessarily treating an individual on one occasion. And I think, like much basic science, the being informed can help us have some ideas about where we can go, because it's clear that society is failing in its ability to stamp out, what they call the war on drugs by just being combative. And we have to think about why people are using drugs in the first place and what we can do to avoid people using them in, certainly in the drugs of addiction, in excessive amounts and dangerous amounts, and how we can deal with that. So I think I'll leave it there, and I'll hand back the questioning, etc., to Henry.
Thank you, Paul. That was really excellent, so comprehensive, and really appreciate that. I'm just going to look to the audience. Adam, you have your hand up.
Hi, Paul. Yeah, I just second Henry in saying this was incredibly comprehensive, and you hit this question, which I always love to ask, which is how does it help? And you did actually kind of think about that at the end. So So yeah, well done. I think it's such an important topic. I guess my question is sort of parallel to drug and alcohol, to the presentation that you've given, because something that's really interesting here is that in evolutionary psychiatry, we often think about negative emotions and where negative emotions are kind of getting overactivated. But this is very much the other side. It's like it's using the positive emotions, and our positive emotions are misleading us, which is quite rare, I guess, in psychiatry. But then I'm also wondering, can you think of any other examples where, you know, an over, like an excess of positive emotion is the problem, rather than an excess of negative emotion?
Well, it's overconfidence, isn't it? And I mean, there's two reasons why it's bad. The drugs themselves, you know, alcohol can harm your liver. It isn't about emotions at all. It's just poisonous, and you get, you know, I think one of the membership when we used to do be examiner was saying what's the effect of large amounts of alcohol on the human brain and the human body, and it affects almost every single organ in the body negatively. You know, once you're drinking more than, you know, whatever it is units a day, you put almost all the organs in your body at risk, some more than others. But the overconfidence, I mean, you only have to be in a car with somebody who's been drinking and is not anxious. They're overconfident and a bit intoxicated, let alone being almost totally sedated, you know, as to see why driving is illegal, you know. But any situation where your judgment is impaired can put you at risk, can't it? That's the point. And your judgment, if you're thinking things are wonderful when they're not, you put yourself in all sorts of situations which are dangerous, which is just as bad but different to when situations are fine and you're taking yourself out of perfectly good situations because you're feeling they're terrible. It's the other side of the coin. But yes, we don't talk about that so much, do we? We sometimes talk about it in terms of psychopathy, where people, you know, don't have the same sort of negative feelings and reactions and behaviours to certain circumstances that the rest of us would worry about, and it gets them into all sorts of problems. So they end up in the, you know, they either end up unemployed or divorced, or, you know, and that's sort of mild levels, or, you know, people really don't like them because they know, you know, how difficult they are to be with. And the same applies to, you know, alcohol and street drugs. If you're married to somebody, you know, or trying to have a relationship with somebody who's, you know, there may be fun at the pub on a Friday evening for a while, but if you've actually got to try and live a life with somebody, you know, and let's be orthodox here and say, you know, work and have a household and have children. Somebody who's using large amount of substances and thinks the world is marvelous the whole time, whilst they're drinking, you know, when it isn't, can be quite difficult to live with. But of course, there are the other more immediate concerns with people using substances, that, you know, when the substances wear off, they often feel absolutely terrible, and they first feel worse than they did before they started. So again, they reinstate. And so this is one of the theories of addiction, of course. But I didn't really go into addictions as such. I mean, I think sometimes addictions are like, you know, there must be an evolutionary reason why certain things are addictive, why certain things are reinforced hugely. And presumably with the drug, some of these actually hijack those systems. So they're being reinforced, and reinforced again to a harmful degree, because they're being presented with something which wouldn't have been available at that level in the natural world previously. But that's another talk for another day. What is the process of addiction as distinct from consumption?
Just wondered, Cass, did you have any questions or comments?
Yeah, I mean, I'll chip in. Paul, thank you. What a really interesting and thorough review. What a lot to squeeze into an hour.
Sorry if I tried to squeeze too much in, actually.
No, thank you. I've got a page of notes here, I would be interested in knowing there is evidence that suggests that we could broaden the debate even to behavioural use, behavioural addictions. I mean, we're not on the topic of addictions, but substances are largely interchangeable, according to the research I can see, depending on availability. So people will use whatever's around, and if there isn't something around, they'll turn to gambling, sex, work, whatever. So there seems to be some sort of unifying psychological drive behind all these sort of.
We're probably talking dopamine, aren't we?
Are we? I mean, my follow-up question would be, if the P factor applies, and which seems to affect substance use problems as much as other common psychiatric problems, is there a shared etiology underlying these underlying substance use, as there would be for other diagnostic categories?
It's yes and no. Certainly dopamine's important in the reward side. So things that increase dopamine, people keep taking it to increase dopamine more and more and more. And of course, being that the human being sometimes has systems that, if you start taking drugs, the human physiology and biochemistry decreases the effect of the second, third, fourth, fifth dose, and so on. So they have to increase doses to get the same effect. And those are a lot of the reward stuff is dopamine based, but it is more complicated than just dopamine. That's the simple pharmacologist's answer. Because dopamine's like electrons. Electrons in a computer don't explain everything that's going on in a computer, but they sort of do. You know what I mean? But you can't really only understand it that way. But of course there are things like, when you cause pain, taking opiates is getting rid of the pain systems. Not necessarily dopamine, although presumably opiates also, these neurotransmitters are all related to each other. Presumably when people take painkillers and stuff like that, they get some dopamine hit. And of course we do with a cup of tea and a bar of chocolate, don't we? Do you know what I mean? So, the sort of final common pathway is probably dopamine, but this is approximate. This is approximate theory of why we use substances, but we're using it to block negatives and to enhance positives. I mean, I know after a pint of beer, I feel a lot fitter and a lot stronger and a lot more, vibrant and everything. So long as it's only once in a while, and one feels less great about 10 pints, although I've never drunk 10 pints, but some people do. So I think the common pathways are the proximate mechanisms like dopamine and the other transmitters which are either causing problems which need to be blocked or increased, along with dopamine sometimes, because they're interconnected. But then there's the psychological, as you say, there are the psychological theories of drug use and addiction, but addiction and repetitive behavior is different to why we start these things in the first place. This talk was mainly about why things are started in the first place, not why we get addicted to them.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Cass. I really enjoyed your chapter in the textbook as well on suicide. It was one of the most stimulating chapters in the book. So Adam, and will we wrap it up at that stage, that point?
Yeah, I think we've hit the hour, so it's probably...
Yeah. So I just to thank Paul again. That was really comprehensive, Paul. Very, very interesting. We could have gone on for a lot longer. And very much appreciate your contribution to this series.
Do I mean, I'm sure you guys have, but do read the chapter, which I think probably explains it in more detail. But it is only a part of what there is to know. Obviously, I haven't gone over proximate things in addictions with the individual substances and what's happening, and I haven't gone over all the proximate psychological theories as to why these things occur. But these alternate reasons, these evolutionary ones, are something I think worth taking into account when we're talking proximate, because it gives the whole. And I think that's the story, isn't it? That's the message from evolutionary theories. They're additive. They complete our understanding. They are not the entire understanding.